I'm William Andreessen, host of Speaking with Students, a part of the Education Podcast Network, just like the show you're listening to now. Shows in the network are individually owned, and opinions expressed may not reflect others. Find other interesting education podcasts at edupodcastnetwork.com.
Hey, welcome back. Steve here, and today I'm talking with Dr. Hayley Watson. She is the founder and CEO of Open Parachute, and Open Parachute supports the mental health of students, teachers, and parents. She's also the author of Finding the Words, Empowering Struggling Students Through Guided Conversations. Oh, so much to talk about, so much to learn. Thanks for listening. Oh, by the way, before you go, it'd be so cool if you took time to help out the podcast. How could you do that, you ask? Oh, I'm glad you asked that question. Well, one, you could tell a friend, share the links. Two, you could go to my website and leave a review and subscribe. And three, how about click on the link on my website homepage, which says Buy Me a Coffee. By doing that, you could donate $1 or $2 or $5 or more. Hey, that would be so awesome. You help me address the costs associated with producing the podcast. Thanks so much. Thanks for listening. Thanks for sharing. You are awesome. Enjoy the show.
100%. And so it's this delicate balance because, of course, it's important to choose who we talk to and to feel safe in those conversations. So it's not about dumping, because that's the flip side of it. Do we just go in and dump our feelings everywhere? That's also not helpful. But if we avoid talking about things altogether and we don't have a space where we can acknowledge and figure out, what's really happening. And sometimes it's about verbally processing. Sometimes we can do that just by writing in a journal or something, but it's about really letting ourselves feel the feelings and relate to them.
It's the Education Podcast, your favorite show, with lots of groovy guests and they share what they know. So crank it up to 10 and let your neighbors know that here's another show with Dr. Steve Milletto. Teaching, learning, leading K12. Teaching, learning, leading K12. Teaching, learning, leading K12. With Dr. Steve Milletto.
Dr. Hayley Watson is the founder and CEO of Open Parachute, a Tier 1 K-12 curriculum program that supports the mental health of students, teachers, and parents. She is also an author and clinical psychologist and holds a PhD in school bullying interventions, along with 4 further degrees in the field of mental health. She has been creating and delivering programs for youth and practitioners across the U.S., Canada, the UK, and Australia for the past 20 years. We've got a lot to talk about today. Hayley, thanks so much for being on the show, and say hi to everyone.
Thank you so much for having me. Hello, everyone. It is such a pleasure to be here.
Let's start off by talking about this. You're a clinical psychologist. What's that mean about you?
Great question. So generally, it means I'm interested in people. I'm interested in why we do the things we do. But the real question you're probably asking is, why am I interested in those things? And a lot of clinical psychologists would agree with me. Some, of course, are not coming from this place. But for me personally, going through hard things, having confusing feelings when I was younger, really, I think that confusion was at the heart of it, not knowing why I thought or felt the way I did or how I acted. And that really drove my first curiosity about why we do what we do. I actually started off studying criminology because I was really interested in kind of the dark side. Why do we do these sort of mean things or cruel things or horrible things? But then that quickly led me to realize, it's because we've gone through painful experiences and, there's a way we can help that. So it really, then came down to a desire to help other people figure out what's going on in their minds earlier, specifically, because I really love working with young people. And so how do we help and encourage that so that they don't have to make so many mistakes and feel so confused and feel so lost throughout their lives? So it really started from that personal place for me.
Awesome. It's really cool when, things take our different directions and so forth. And, as a note, I can totally understand criminal psychology, looking at all the criminal side of it and why they do what they do.
Fascinating.
Would be very fascinating. So I watched your TEDx talk, and during the presentation, you shared that youth mental health is not as complicated as we make it out to be. Could you talk a little bit about this?
Absolutely. So when we think about youth mental health, it can be really overwhelming and sometimes scary to think, what's happening? We don't really get it. Why are so many kids struggling? But it actually is quite simple when you break it down. So for any of us, when we are in a place in our mind that's confused or sad or scared or depressed or anxious, it's always because earlier on, maybe just recently, maybe a lot earlier on, we went through something hard. And those hard things don't have to result in sort of negative mental health outcomes. But when we don't have the support we need to work through that and process it and understand it, that's when our minds get really clouded, because all of those feelings start building up and building up and building up. And if they're not processed, they kind of become this backlog, a little bit like a dam. And then all of a sudden the dam is released and we don't realize where each of those feelings and thoughts comes from. And that's when we have big challenging mental health concerns. So it's very simple when you help young people recognize and process each challenge as it occurs, it doesn't compound like that. So that's the sort of simplification of it, recognizing harm and providing resources and tools to work through that harm.
That's awesome. It's having been in education, this is my 37th year in public education in Georgia, and I was a history teacher for 9 years and then an assistant principal in a couple of places, and then eventually a high school principal in a couple of different schools where I was focused on changing the environment of those schools. And one of the things that you talk about in dealing with the different aspects of what might be going on in the background, or what's causing the behaviors that's happening that they're showing on the outside, or whether it's an out there type behavior or withdrawal and stuff like this, and you just have any number of possibilities that are going on in a school. One of the things that I've heard you talk about is that it is easier to avoid talking about our emotions and feelings. Could you share why this is so and why this is not good? Because I know over all those years I had experiences where, can we talk for a minute? Tell me what's going on. And I know in my own, because like I've heard you mention about you don't want to interact with this person. And I've had, there's times when I go to meetings where, I'm talking to everybody. And there's other times when I'm going to meetings and I'm making sure there's certain areas that I'm not going to and stuff like this. So
100%. And so it's this delicate balance because, of course, it's important to choose who we talk to and to feel safe in those conversations. So it's not about dumping, because that's the flip side of it. Do we just go in and dump our feelings everywhere? That's also not helpful. But if we avoid talking about things altogether and we don't have a space where we can acknowledge and figure out, what's really happening. And sometimes it's about verbally processing. Sometimes we can do that just by writing in a journal or something, but it's about really letting ourselves feel the feelings and relate to them. If we don't do that, like I talked about before, the dam builds up. These feelings, they don't just leave, they stay there. That's the challenging thing about feelings. They leave if we deal with them. They leave quite quickly. But if we don't, then they stick around and then they create a backlog in our system. And that can come out physically, it can come out in our behavior, it can come out in our health, it can come out in our mental health. But the reason why we like to avoid that is because it's uncomfortable. It really is. I mean, it's the same thing when you have an injury, for example, and you have to go to physical therapy. It's way easier not to go to physical therapy. It's frustrating. It's sometimes boring. You have to do these exercises. It's hard. But if you don't do that, you're always going to have a weakness in your body. And then that's going to lead to challenges down the road. It's exactly the same with feelings. We don't want to do it. And it has this frustration around it and it's work. But if we don't do it, it's that sort of short-term pain for long-term gain is kind of the way you want to look at it.
Gotcha. And I have to say this, you've been talking to my doctor, physical therapist or something. It's a lot easier to go, wow, I don't think I'm going today.
Exactly. It's hard. We don't want to do things that make us uncomfortable. That's just the natural human way. So
much so. I grew up in Florida, and there's this convenience store exists all over the place. But there's this series of stores, they're called 7-Elevens. And they used to have this commercial on TV. By the way, I'm not sponsored by them, nor does this have to do anything with that. It has to do with a commercial they used to have a long time ago, which has always stuck with me because it was just a goofy little commercial where you'd see all these houses with all their front doors, and all of them had garages, and then there was a car parked outside the garage, and these people would come out of their house, close the door and have like a briefcase or something, and they go over their cars and they look at each other and go, "Hi, how you doing?" And then they get in the car and they would leave. That's all they say to each other. And the whole point of the commercial was, because then like a couple of them, like one or two of them went to 7-Eleven, and then when they went to 7-Eleven, they had the coffee, and then they were talking to each other and
they're chatting. I love it.
Yes, exactly. And what's funny is that a lot of times in our work environments, we also experience the same sort of thing where you're a hi, how are you, but you don't really engage people. I mean, any thoughts?
Absolutely. And you ask, but you don't really want, it's not really an invitation,
Right.
How are you doing? Is really like, I'm going to keep walking. So, I'm not expecting you to actually tell me how you're doing. Absolutely.
It's kind of typical in schools, because one of the things that can happen, I actually had someone one time stop me as a principal. I was dealing with something and I was going through, and I guess I did not see them in the hallway, and they thought I was mad at them. And they said to somebody else, "Is he angry at me? What did I do?" And they told me later, they said, this person, you probably won't go to see him because they think you're angry. And I was like, what the? And I had to go deal with, some goofy thing that I had to take care of. And I didn't even, so I had to have a conversation with him about, "I'm sorry, I wasn't angry at you.
Yeah. And that's a perfect example of how we just assume and project. And there's so many things going on that are usually false. Our brain makes up a lot of stuff. And so if we don't have a space, and it doesn't mean that the whole day has to be consumed with these kind of emotional conversations, but ironically, if we were having them more and they were more normalized, they'd be less needed. Because the problem is nobody feels like they can say, like that person didn't feel like they could say, hey, yo, are you mad at me? They didn't feel like they were safe enough to do that because they're not used to it. Whereas if they could, you'd go, no, it's fine. And then you carry on, but they don't. And they tell someone else. And then there's this triangulation. And then it's like, this is the buildup we're talking about.
Thanks for talking about that. It's interesting. I think, there's so many different times or situations that we either avoid or, and it may be just something simple, or we make up the stories about what we think the other person might be thinking about when they don't even know that we exist, maybe.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I would say that 99% of relationship challenges are about these miscommunications, about, somebody assuming something or thinking that you mean something that you don't mean. And it's all because of our own past experiences that we put onto other people.
It's just fascinating. All right. So, and it's so important because my audience is educators of all kinds, and in our world, I think knowing the more they know, the more it's going to help them. So, good stuff. So let's shift gears for a minute and talk about Open Parachute. Why'd you create it?
Yeah. So Open Parachute is a K-12 mental health curriculum program, as you mentioned in the beginning. And the reason I created it is that I was working as a clinical psychologist in Australia, actually, in Sydney, Australia. And I was only able to see one young person at a time, and really only for 1 hour a week max for a bit of a period of time. And there's only so many kids you can help that way. It felt very limiting. And I really have this burning desire to help youth. And I really had this motivation to do it. And so what I wanted was to figure out, how do we get this out there more? Because what I would see as well is I would work individually with a young person, and we'd be able to figure things out and process, but then they'd go back into their peer group, and none of their peer group had any of that level of awareness. And so it was really hard for them to be able to continue that learning and growth, because we need a community around us that has a skill set in this, that has an ability to speak this way or think this way. And so the idea of making a classroom program means that every single young person can build up a skill set. It's not about doing therapy with every child in class. It's about creating this basic skill set so that everybody has a place to jump off from, because so many kids fall through the cracks. So many kids don't have access to psychologists for so many reasons: stigma, financial, just simply access, people in rural communities, all of these things get in the way. And so how do we make sure that all of this really important and really simple information, and I say simple because it's not easy. I always say this to clients, it's not easy, but it is simple things that we need to do, but we need to be encouraged to do them. We need to have a space to do them. We need that kind of reflection. And that's the big goal with Open Parachute, is to create generational change. How can we imagine if every single young person has the skills to recognize why they're doing what they're doing, understand that when they're doing something unhelpful, they can change that. If they feel, bad about themselves or they're having negative thoughts, they can work on that. They can make healthy choices. They can do things that support their well-being. Imagine the world we live in. Imagine what that would do, the ripple effect, what that would do to domestic violence, what that would do to aggression, what that would do to school absenteeism, what that would do to, levels of depression and anxiety in adults, all of these things that come from just not having that basic skill set or that access to be able to really work on their own mental health.
So powerful and so important. It's we have I have many different stories that share the importance of this as you're dealing with. I worked with a young man who was constantly fighting with his parents, and the only reason why I found that out was because he was fun to have in class, and then suddenly he kind of shut down, and I talked to him a couple of different times about why. I mean, it's easy to say it this way. He should have been up in the A and high B range, and suddenly he went from that down to this very consistent, very low C, and it's like, what's going on? And he, I'm okay. Nothing wrong with it. Has nothing to do with you, Mr. Mileto, and stuff like this. Well, the next year, he saw me in the hallway, and he came up and he apologized to me, and he said, I just want to let you know that last year I was fighting with my parents about all kinds of stuff, and I really, it was important to him to tell me it wasn't me, and I'm like, well, because he totally changed all kinds of things about who he was and that year, and then he was back to him the next year. But that's just one of many examples where if your eyes are open and your ears are open, you're paying attention, you realize something's wrong.
Exactly. And how amazing would it have been if there was a program in place where it was normalized for him to be reflecting on this and feel like it was okay for him to speak about it and to seek help if he needed it. And also for everyone around him to understand this and be able to support, his ability to move through that. Maybe it wouldn't have been a whole year that he needed to have that. Maybe it would have been a couple of weeks and then he would have kind of bounced back. But absolutely, there's so many of these stories. And so many times it's completely invisible because maybe they come into your class and they're like that. And you go, okay, well, that's just the way they are. Right. And you don't realize, wait a minute, there's something going on here that if they could just address that, then they'd be able to engage in school. We can't focus on academics if we're struggling with our mental health. We just can't. There's not enough space in our brain for that.
So much so. And there's so many different situations. I mean, you just never know what it could or might be. And some of them who think they're juggling everything together and they're doing fine. And then you find out one day that person's, crying in the back corner of the hallway. And
exactly.
You're like,
and that's that challenge. And that's that challenge of avoidance. We all do that. We all think we're fine. Usually we don't realize, when I was a teenager, I definitely thought, some teenagers really feel like they're struggling, but some teenagers think everything's fine and they have no idea that things could be so much better, or that actually what they're doing is just holding on with clenched fists, and that's not really going to result in positive outcomes in the end anyway. Even kids like that get really good grades and that seem really engaged, but inside are feeling really hollow, that's not a great outcome either, because that's all going to kind of collapse around them eventually, which is what happened for me for sure.
Gotcha. And it's so, it just, the importance of adults understanding enough to recognize that, hey, something's might be not right.
Exactly. And it's not the educator's job to fix that or to even understand that. Absolutely. That's a mental health professional. But if we empower educators with tools and with resources that help them teach their students how to help themselves, this means that these conversations and these dialogues can be so helpful in class, and it helps educators feel a little bit less helpless in this situation that they're facing.
Oh, I can definitely see that, so much so. So let's flip it, because it's not just about students. One of the things that Open Parachute strives to do is help teachers. Can you talk about this just a little bit?
Definitely. So we have our educator well-being as a core part of Open Parachute. And we also have educator training resources. So there's kind of two parts to it. One part, and the most important part, is their own well-being. Teachers are under so much stress. It is a very, very full-on job. I don't have to tell you that, you know that. And increasingly with time, the more that these, that students are struggling with their mental health, that gets placed on teachers. They feel that they're in that. There's sort of that secondary trauma that they experience with, having to go through all of these situations with kids and not necessarily knowing what to do to help them. And just the burden and pressure of this profession. So if we focus on teacher well-being and we help teachers have a space to reflect, to learn some skills to help themselves, to really sort of understand what's happening for them, this is what creates a whole school community. And this is what we really do, is we work with the whole school community, because we can't be only telling students, this is what you need to do and this is a skill set, if we're not role modeling it ourselves. And if we don't feel well, it's the same with parents. If you're really stressed and you're trying to calm your child down, it's not going to work very well. No. You have to be well too. You have to feel good. And if you feel good and if you feel empowered, you can then also encourage your students. Hey, I've done this too. It's hard for me to take a deep breath when I'm stressed also, but I've been working on it. It just has that normalizing effect. And it means the whole school community can be a place where everyone is well. So that's a really big part of it. And then the other piece is training resources for educators, because that's one of the biggest things I hear from teachers is, we don't have enough training in this. We don't come prepared in this. We need to have a little bit more of a skill set. And at the same time, you have no time as a teacher. So it's this really delicate balance. And so part of what we focus on is that the resources we have are so easy to engage with. You don't really need any training, and you sort of learn alongside your students, which we love about it. It's sort of like professional development in class. But we also have, for teachers that really think, I really want to feel a little bit more comfortable with this, we have a series of training resources that are really just, again, simplifying it. How do I support my students in my everyday interactions? What are some little tips I can use? Just so that, again, we're trying to take the burden of pressure off of teachers, that they have to get it all right or know everything to be able to support student mental health, and really make sure that they feel well and that they have a skill set and tools at their disposal to make this a simple and easy thing to weave into their classroom.
That's awesome. One of the things I got to make sure that I mention here is that a lot of times educators, they get so focused on trying to help the child, that the family, and they start feeling overwhelmed because they can't fix everything. And
yes.
And one of the things that happens as a result of that is that they start not paying attention to those same feelings of frustration, and they bring in that overwhelmed feeling, and the next thing you know is they're like, and they don't realize that they're in that world of do I matter? Is this making a difference? And then they're talking to there's the whole voice thing about what is my world? Can I even do this and stuff? To the point where they, the burnout and the overwhelm and stuff like this, where they decide whether they want to do this anymore.
Exactly. And this is really common. Burnout is really, really common. And what you described is exactly what happens, and when we're in helping professions, we want to help. But there's a really big difference between helping and fixing. And I think it's really important that you said that word. We can't fix things. And I think that's the whole aim of what we're trying to do is help encourage teachers with, these are the things you can do. And if you do these things, you will know you're helping, but also to take the pressure off that, you can't fix things for anyone else. You can't. And that's the devastating part about working with young people, is that you grow to love and appreciate them, and you see them in pain, and on some level, there's nothing you can do about some of that pain. But if you do have tools that you know are helping, that takes off that whole burden and that whole pressure, like you were describing. And then you can go home every day feeling satisfied, feeling inspired, feeling like you are doing what you wanted to do as a teacher, instead of that pressure and that, oh, this too much. And there's, all these things to do and I can't do it all. That comes from that compounded stress.
What's funny is that when I became a principal, I wanted kids to get to know me so that I didn't think everyone was in trouble or stuff like this, and they didn't think that's the only way that I did things. So I played in the band. I'd play my trumpet in the band, or I played pickup games of soccer, and which I did a better job at coaching than, but they'd let me score once in a while and stuff like that, and then just the whole interaction and stuff like this. I wish because I did clubs and organizations when I was a teacher, and I sponsored all this stuff, but it was a different sort of focus. You had deadlines and stuff like this for those clubs and things like this. But when I was a principal, it did a whole different world for me, which in the beginning it was all about just meeting, getting kids to interact with me and stuff like this. So we see each other a lot differently than just the guy who gets mad at me or something like that. And and what happened was it started becoming the thing that you kind of look forward to, because all your problems went away because you're just interacting with the kids. And I think
Absolutely.
As a teacher, we don't think about stuff like that.
Yeah. And for a good reason. There's no time.
Right.
And so it really is. And this is why it's so important that the school is supporting teachers, that it's not just the individual teacher that has to figure out, well, how do I prioritize mental health when I have all these academic priorities? The school has to invest in this idea and buy into this idea and say, yeah, there does need to be time for connection and time for skill building in the mental health area. And it always starts at the top. So it's, the school leader, the district leader, they have to be on board with this, because that trickles down and that helps the teachers know that there's a safe space for them too, and that they can make these choices. So important. I do have to share this, because one of the things I discovered, and it was only because the gentleman suggested it to me, because he knew I was having a rough spot of it, and he said, hey, Steve, and he's the guy who drove the golf cart around the campus to make sure that we didn't have alien invaders, or we didn't have, the residents deciding to leave at different times. And he said, we don't have to talk. He goes, I know you're having a rough day. He goes, why don't you, give me a holler when you get a chance, and I'll come get you, and I'll just drive you around on my route, and then we can drive back off. And I found out that driving in that goofy golf cart, and and especially because he also was pretty dangerous. He'd go through areas that you're like, holy crap, what is this? But I started using it to put myself in timeout, and I would tell people, when you see me in that golf cart, that means that I'm trying to get back on track. All right. And I said, just don't bother me. I'll be back in about 10 minutes. And well, it was just interesting how something like that worked tremendously, just to say, okay, I'm good. Yeah. And what's amazing about it is that you let people know that you were doing it for that reason, because that's you being vulnerable. That's wonderful role modeling, because if you do that and you say, hey, yeah, there's times when I don't have it all together. There's times where I need something to help me. That gives your whole staff permission that, oh, it's okay if I'm in that place too, because we all are. But if the leader is showing and saying, yeah, these are the skills that I use, these are the tools that I use, all of a sudden that school starts to become a much safer place for everyone, staff and students, to start saying, oh, well, maybe I need something to get myself back on track.
Very cool. I like that. So let's use that to shift to your book, Finding the Words, Empowering Struggling Students Through Guided Conversations. Who's its audience and why?
So the audience is any educator, or really any caring adult that is interacting with young people on a regular basis. Also parents absolutely can benefit from it. But I really wrote it for educators because I work with schools all over the world, with Open Parachute, and, I'm talking to teachers all of the time. And as I run trainings and things like that, the biggest question I get asked from teachers is, they'll describe a specific situation. They'll be in a situation with a student. They'll say, what do I actually say? What are the words that I use here? And so, it sort of led me to realize that teachers really need and educators really need a template and steps to follow and a bit of a framework. And it's a little bit like the way we all learn CPR. So we're not doctors. We don't know how to do heart surgery, nor should we try to do heart surgery. But all of us have simple steps that we know how to follow, that we practice, that are normalized to help a person that's in crisis in front of us, in a health crisis. And most educators don't necessarily have that framework for mental health. And so there's this belief that I might say the wrong thing. I shouldn't say anything at all because I'm going to make it worse. I'm not a trained professional, so I shouldn't have anything to do with this conversation. As soon as someone's talking about emotion, I need to refer them onward. And yes, we do need to have referral pathways, 100%. But you are also interacting with that student. What are you going to do? Ignore them when they're in that situation? What are you going to do when they show up in class the next day? And so many teachers, so many caring teachers are saying, I want to help, but I don't know exactly how to navigate this. What can I say? What can't I say? And so the book is really helping teachers and educators and adults to understand in each situation. So each chapter is a different mental health challenge that students might face. So they can just flip to the chapter. It's meant as a guidebook. So they don't have to sit down and read the whole thing. They can if they want, but they can really, something happens in class, a student's acting a certain way, acting out, missing class, disengaged, angry, depressed, whatever it is. They can flip to that place and say, okay, what are some of the steps? What's the framework here? And then they actually get to read through an example of a conversation that I've had with a young person and really break down, oh, that's what it could look like. So they have a template to follow. Not that they have to say things word for word, but it's this framework that we need in our minds to have the confidence to even engage in saying anything at all. And know that we are going to help and we're not going to harm. And that's so important for educators to have that sense of power in those situations.
Oh, so much so, because that's probably one of the most anxiety building things that exist in an educator's world, because you have these different interactions that you weren't really trained for unless you went some other direction first, because usually we're about interacting and delivering content and coming up with instructional different ways to help the kids understand and stuff like this. And then you have to have, for example, the parent conference. And
yes, 100%. Yes. And this is the thing. Teachers are on the front line. You can't hide from the mental health challenges of students. You're facing them every single day. And so we really are putting teachers in a not great position to say, here you are, you're going to deal with it every day, but you're not trained to deal with it. So don't do anything, just refer, and it's like, well, what does that leave them with? That doesn't leave them with a lot of options. And that's where we're getting this vicarious trauma and this stress and this burnout, because those interactions where you think you're not helping, or you're worried if you're not helping, or you're not sure what to say, they build up. And so if we can give that basic skill set, then we can really create a situation where students have multiple adults that can be supportive and caring and kind and reinforce and validate them, not just their one psychologist, or maybe no one if they don't have a psychologist, that they can feel like they can feel safe with.
That's awesome. It's one of the things that I think is so important, is that there's this interaction or developing a relationship with that, even if it's just one teacher that there's some feeling that they understand me or they get me or something like this, so that person knows their name, sees them in the hallway, says, hey, Steve, how you doing today? One of the things that you talk about, and with Open Parachute and such, is that educators learn to make the school a safe place.
Yeah.
And let's go into that just a little deeper now. Why is that important?
Absolutely. So when you think of, a young person, a student, it's hard to be young. It's really hard to be young. They want to fit in so badly. We want to show a brave face. We do this as adults too, but students especially. And so when we do that, it means we're avoiding talking about our feelings. We're avoiding kind of those uncomfortable things. And so creating an emotionally safe environment where they can show up and they can, have someone get it when they're having an off day, have someone care enough to ask, have someone they can say a few words to. Again, this doesn't have to be a therapeutic relationship. It's just being able to be real with someone, to not have that mask on. When we have that, and just like you said, all we need is one person. We do not need, every single person to see us that way. It's great. The more people that do, the more validated we feel. But when we do, when it's mirrored to us that we can just be ourselves, that means we can carry that forward, and these young people can not put so much pressure on themselves and not try to pretend so much. And of course, that leads to so many mental health challenges down the road when we do that pretending. So that safety is really about just, can I be real? Can I be myself? And there are some really simple ways that teachers can create that safety. Again, not having to be the therapist, but just some simple conversations, some simple ways to respond to young people, to just normalize and validate and say, yeah, I get it. It's okay to be like that. Even like your example, role modeling. Sometimes I struggle too. Sometimes I get stressed. These kinds of things mean that students can relax. They don't have to be always trying to wear that mask, always trying to be pretending things are okay when they're not.
Yeah, I think it's so important what you're talking about, because you can't be an educator in schools, especially when you get to the middle school to high school years, where there's so much pressure on them to try and figure out who they are, or to present an image of somebody who's cool, or in vogue, or whatever word works to understand it. But which means that also what comes with that is things you have to ignore or leave behind, or say you don't like anymore, or something like this. And talk about just incredible pressure that they're dealing with, and no wonder why they really don't want to talk about anything.
Exactly. And to really, figure out how to live in line with your values, you need space to be honest about what's okay for you, what's not okay for you, what you like, what you don't like, what you feel, what you don't feel, what you think, what you don't think, yourself, as a individual person, not with all of the peer pressure and all of the things that everyone else is doing. And that requires some level of being seen for who you really are.
So important. One of the things that your book has, these, like you talked about, the scenarios, it has, a very strong practical aspect to it. Can you talk to that just a little bit?
Absolutely. So there is a framework that I present in the book, which was taken from analyzing hundreds and hundreds of different interviews that I'd done with young people over the years. And it's a framework of 6 specific steps, 6 specific tools that we want to do, things that we want to come across when we're communicating with young people. And that framework, those 6 steps, is then broken down into how does this apply into each of these different mental health challenges. And then there's a really, again, a guided discussion where, you can really see, oh, this is how you would say that one step. This is how this would work. And one of the pieces that actually teachers love the most about the book is the part where I actually analyze my own responses. And a lot of the times my analysis is, I could have said that differently. Maybe if I had a chance to go back, I would do that again. I would say this or whatever. Nice. And really kind of just showing, this is why I did this. This is why I did this. This is why I shouldn't have done this. And I think why people love that part so much, and why I'm so glad it's in the book, is that it's also helping teachers to take the pressure off of, we don't have to get this perfect. I never get it perfect. I bumble around with young people just as much as the next person, but it's the intention. If we're showing up and we care, they pick up on that. And kids are very forgiving, actually. Even teenagers are very forgiving when they know that you're there and you care, and so these conversations can be very fluid. And also one of the things I point out in the book is, these conversations are usually stunted. You have 1 minute, or you have 30 seconds, or maybe one time you happen to have 5 minutes. And so this is all fine. And so it's sort of like, here's the framework for you. Here's the understanding. And then whenever you can interject a comment, try interjecting one of these comments, and it just builds. It slowly builds up that relationship in that safe space. But it's a practical understanding so that teachers have that confidence. Okay, I'm doing something that's helpful. I'm not harming them by these conversations. And, I just do bits and bits. and they can watch their relationship flourish. They can watch these young people slowly start to feel more comfortable in their own skin and open up a little bit more. And sometimes they're not even opening up to you, and that's perfectly fine. Maybe they're going and finally telling their friend because you said something that helped them feel a bit more validated, or they're telling a parent, or they're telling a counselor. So it's not even about creating a space where they have to be communicating with you a lot. It's by letting them know it's okay to feel how you feel. It's okay to be who you are, and you're seen for that. So that means you can have more confidence to be that person and be yourself in every context that you're in.
That's awesome. I appreciate it. Hayley, we're getting close to finishing up. Where could our listeners find additional information, connect, and learn more?
So openparachuteschools.com is our website. And so that has information about our programs. It also has information about the book. And then LinkedIn is the main place that I am. If people want to connect with me personally, just Dr. Hayley Watson on LinkedIn. Very excited to always connect to educators everywhere. So please feel free to reach out.
Very cool. All of that information in the show notes. And so it's easy to just click on and go find you. So good stuff. I got two last questions I like to ask my guests. And the first one goes like this. When so much is going on that you may feel overwhelmed and want to quit, how do you keep going?
It's a really good question. For me, it always comes back to purpose. So, my whole journey with Open Parachute was about that. How do I really tap into what I can, my purpose in the world, or, that's what I call it. How do I tap into what I can bring to the world that feels like a contribution? And I didn't share, but when I started Open Parachute and I was working as a psychologist, I was very burnt out at that point. And I didn't, somehow the purpose was lost there. And so ever since kind of making that big decision to say, I'm going to try something big, I'm going to try something different, a lot of stress involved in running your own organization, not a skill set that I had at all. And it's really hard doing this work with, in mental health. It's frustrating. And, as you know, education can be amazing, and education systems can also be really frustrating. And so when it's overwhelming, when it's hard, I always come back to that feeling of, I know deep down in my bones that this is what I'm meant to be doing. And that always drives me. It always gives me more energy than I think I have. And it always helps me know, because I think there's a difference between, things are hard and it's because I'm not doing it right in some way, things are not working in some way, and I need to, and sometimes that happens. Absolutely. I need to change things. I need to make something different here. And then there's the hard, but we're on the right path, and it's just hard because it's hard. And so I think if I boil it down and I say, okay, what's here that I can remove, but how do I get back to just, so for educators, how this would relate is, how do I get back to the reason I became a teacher? How do I get back to that core purpose and passion? That's what I always come back to. And then, things just sort of tend to melt away, and things tend to kind of get a little bit easier, even when it's overwhelming. That's
awesome. Thanks for sharing, because that's something that we find ourselves in a lot, and having some thoughts about how to get through it, as opposed to just saying, "Oh, I'm done."
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Good stuff. Last question. Do you have a teacher in your past who made a difference in your life? If so, who was it? And what would you say if given the chance to say thank you?
Yes. Mr. Maxwell, who was a history teacher, actually, like
Cool.
you. And I actually sadly learned that he just recently passed away. So this is very poignant for me. The reason I loved him so much, and I always remember him, and I literally only had him for this one history class in grade 12. So this is a very short touch point. But I had learned history every year. They called it social studies. I grew up in Canada, so we had social studies every year. And all I remember was a bunch of names and dates and places. And then Mr. Maxwell was teaching us about World War II. And he made it come alive. So he told stories of soldiers, being in the trenches, and he told stories of, post-traumatic stress. And he really helped me live it. And it was so powerful. And it was the first time I said, wow, history is so interesting. And, reflecting on that really is part of what led to my inspiration for Open Parachute in a way, because we base all of our lessons around documentary stories of real students sharing their stories. And it's that relatability that we need to see to make it real. What's a human part of this? Okay, we talk about anxiety and depression, but what's a real person's experience of that? And what's that like? And so for me, we learned about all these wars, we learned about this and that, but what was it like back then? And that was just so inspiring. He was just a very, very inspiring man. So I wish I could say thank you to him and let him know how much he really influenced in this sort of way that I hadn't even really realized until I reflected on it, these things that I'm able to do in the world.
That's so awesome. Thanks so much for sharing that story.
Mm-hmm. My pleasure.
Hayley, thank you so much for talking with us and sharing about Open Parachute, your book, Finding the Words, empowering struggling students through guided conversations and supporting students with challenging issues. What a powerful focus and awesome tools for working with students. Wish you the best in all you do.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure to be here.
Hey, you have been listening to Teaching Learning Leading K12, a podcast to help you help kids achieve their dreams. Teaching Learning Leading K12 is a member of the Education Podcast Network. Podcasts for educators, podcasts by educators. Teaching Learning Leading K12 is a member of the podcast network based in Canada called Voice Ed Radio. Voice Ed Radio, your voice is right here. The opinions expressed on Teaching Learning Leading K12 are those of the guests and host. Teaching Learning Leading K12 is intended to share ideas, advice, and suggestions. Teaching Learning Leading K12 is produced for educational purposes. Hey, thanks for listening. It would be awesome if you visited my website at stephenmiletto.com and connected with me, left a review, and listened to more episodes. And by the way, you could also share it with your friends, with your family, and your colleagues. Thanks so much. You're awesome.